Jay Yeo, welcome to Lingofest.
Thank you.
Thank you for making the time to speak with me. So we met, so to speak, met each other, and that's a thing actually I want to unpack. What does meeting mean these days?
Yeah.
But, a few months ago, in a virtual webinar, or was a presentation that you gave focusing on Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher, the late 20th century. I'm a big reader of his, and I was aware of that series that that meetup is really amazing because it brings a lot of very interesting people. Anyway, that's where we met. And I'm mentioning that because my favorite people, let's just say it like that, are people who dwell in different worlds, who dwell in, I don't know, philosophy and technology, or psychology and literature, and I don't know what else. All right, people who are able to live in all these different kind of worlds. And the reason why I think I find these people are really interesting because they're able to connect dots. They're able to help me detect some things that I would not be able to detect on my own, living in my own bubble. So anyway, I just wanted to give that context that we're talking to somebody who lives in multiple worlds, which is great, right? So let's start by mentioning the fact that you have degrees in religious studies, right?
Yeah, so I went, it's funny, I started undergrad thinking I like German. And so I was going to go for German literature and philosophy. And the philosophy definitely stuck. The German literature, I did German literature and I realized I liked using German, but I didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time just reading German literature and that be it. And I was kind of like, not anti-religion, but I was definitely not looking for taking any religious studies classes. But I had an opening in my schedule. And so I took a religious studies class. I started to, like you said, sort of see different connections and ask questions between some of the different classes I was taking, and started to get really interested in that and language and a bunch of other things that sort of, like I said, kind of connected together. And that was an undergrad, and then that kind of took off from there. So so I focused on Middle Eastern Islamic studies and then religion and philosophy in undergrad. And from there, continued kind of the focus on philosophy and theory, but in a religious studies context with a more specific focus on, Islamic studies. And then if you want to narrow it down and pigeonhole even further, Quran recitation, which is where kind of an interest in sound studies, human interaction with sound, human production of sound, and then, the role of technology and how technology has transformed that, sort of all came together. So none of these interests were planned at all, but it was something that kind of developed out of, just continuously asking questions and pushing a little bit further and seeing connections in new places.
Yeah. I think the most interesting lives are the unplanned lives, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You bump into things and then you go that way and you find out, hey, there's another way also, and so on and so forth. Yeah, my life is more or less like that, except that I had degrees in computer science, and then at some point I realized I don't want to do a PhD in computer science because I don't want to be teaching computer science. So I switched immediately to because I was doing a lot of language technology, right? Obviously, language is heavily, very easily you ask your questions that are philosophical, right? What is meaning, right? Okay, how do we represent meaning? And is it stable or is it contextual and so forth? And so I branched to philosophy of science. So the audience is all about sound, sonic stuff, audio, whether in the context of consumption. So you hear stuff, you hear like podcasts, and you hear music, as well as creation, right? A lot of people now are creating content through audio podcasts, right? Which I think is amazing, which is great. And then there's also the conversational AI, meaning you're interacting with an entity, right? You're interacting with a bot that talks, that does conversation, right? So as you can see, all these things very quickly one starts to ask deep questions, right? Like for example, one of my favorite clips, so to speak, or quotes is the medium is the message, right, by Marshall McLuhan, right? And I always understood it in an abstract way until I started delving into all these actual trying to help people create content, and then discovering that what they create really is in function in a very fundamental way of what it is that they're using to create that content, right? So
Yeah.
in a very, for example, short audio versus longer audio, right? That's very different. So the content tends to be for short audio, like more prepared, either more prepared, right? They have to craft it, just like they say, you've had more time, I'd have written a shorter letter. Was it Pascal or whatever? They attributed to multiple people. Either that or spontaneous, right? You hear something, you hear a joke or whatever, and you record it and there. And then whereas podcasting longer is more of, free going conversations and right, and more of a
Ongoing engagement. Yeah.
yeah, like more like companionship and so forth. So my point really is that very quickly, I think philosophy and the humanities are going to be more and more important, I believe, because we are bumping into these very fundamental questions about what is an identity, right? What does it mean to be a person, or what does it mean to be? Is the bot, for example, that talks to you? How do you treat that thing, right? You use the same protocols that you use with another person? So very quickly, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of whatever bubbles up, and so that's one of the things that I'm always harping on when I
Yeah.
talk to folks is, you should probably, even if you're an engineer, so to speak, take a couple of philosophy classes, psychology classes. Don't consider those as, okay, I'm just going to fulfill my requirements and move on and get my degree and make money, because those things are really important. Then the more I get into my career, the more I find out about them. So let's turn to audio and the work. And there's a paper that you shared with me that I read. I have a lot of questions there, but let's start by describing what that project was all about, and maybe how it relates to today and what we're doing with audio.
Yeah. So the project that you're mentioning, or the paper that I shared with you, it was probably like one of my earliest forays into thinking about, not the earliest, but an earlier one, about thinking about technology and sound, and actually personally using technology with sound from an academic perspective at the time. And it really, it got a lot of my wheels turning, both from sort of what it means to look at something sonically from an academic perspective and incorporate sound into analysis. But then also kind of looking towards the future, now that we have, these capabilities with sound and with technology, what is it? What can we do with it? And what are the consequences of doing those things with it? So the project in particular was focused on a 10th century munya, or village in Al-Andalus, or the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain. And so basically what I did for that, I had an ongoing interest in sound. And so there was I worked with a recreation of the munya that somebody had made, Claire Anderson. She had made it in, or she had worked with some folks, a team, to make it in Unity 3D. And it was just like a video game, technology or platform. In any case, and so I kind of it was mocked up. It hadn't really been built to completion yet. So I took that and sort of worked with it to start playing around with sound and see what happened with when you start inserting sound into spaces and recreated spaces from the past, right, from hundreds of years ago. What can you learn from an academic perspective? So like analytically, so your point about the medium as a message, right? One of the things that I consider in that paper is almost like sonic attention as a mode of analysis. and what that reveals when you are just thinking sonically through things or experiencing sonically through things, and what that reveals, but then also what we've missed by not thinking about sound in the past. And then again, like I said, forward looking, what can we do now that we can insert sound in this kind of virtual space where, you know, you can be a little character and walk around and hear different things and see a recreation of something from the past. And how does that engage people differently than just looking at pictures? The piece itself is focused on, I'm looking at it from an art history perspective as well, art and architecture. So I'm looking at this Munya and the different visual representations that are within it. You know, obviously it's this historical context and the different objects that would have been within it, its owner and so forth. But adding in sound of different sorts to kind of play around with what does that reveal about Munya? How does that deepen our understanding of it? And then, you know, what do we do from here?
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so just that I can visualize the thing that you worked on. So it would be some a visual, right? A 3D visual. I'll be traversing it, walking around, and then I would also be hearing things as well. And right, is that right?
Yeah. So it's basically like, so it's a villa, and it has in the back there's kind of a pool of sorts, and then in the front it's like a wide open kind of field that's got it's got walls on the side, stone walls on the side. There would have been, you know, different kinds of trees, fruits, vegetables, gardens, and so forth surrounding it, as well as inside of it. And the inside of it has kind of like a hall, and then two sort of separate rooms to the side of the hall. And what I tried out and had many different kind of sound options for how you could kind of walk through and experience it. But outside, one of the things that I did, right, is put a couple of different kinds of birds that have symbolic significance and sort of parlay with what would have been seen in the art and architecture, but also, you know, lived in the environment at that time in that place. And then the inside had played around with different locations and different sounds and contemporary sounds. So like, you know, contemporary music, as well as, I mean, they're contemporarily made, but historical sounds. So poetry from the era that was recited in Arabic as well as in English. So what happens when you translate it? What happens when you have a female voice versus a male voice? So several different sounds in different locations. And I kind of played around with the location to see, you know, because it makes it alive when you experience something sonically, right? Like I can walk around and I am kind of, you know, I'm still inside, but I'm starting to get closer to the outside, and I can hear the birds more now, you know, and I'm a little bit more separated from the humans and the sort of, you know, social interaction, or I drift more inside, or there's a woman's voice, but it's in a separate room. And I'm enjoying the woman's voice, but it also frees up my eyes to look around my environment, because I'm not looking at a person that's singing or reciting anything. So a lot of kind of different, I don't know, I guess plays, but the space itself is really interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it somewhere? Have you deployed it somewhere or not? Or is it?
So that's actually a good question. So when I was working on it, it was not web ready at that point, and I'd made a couple of recommendations in terms of where to take it next. And Blair Anderson, she's still a professor at UNC. She's actually she reached out actually just a couple of weeks ago. She's kind of reinvigorating the project, and she's got a new team working on it. And I believe they are aiming to make it web available at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I guarantee you that this can be done since you have all the artifacts in you know, in the meta, right? In the metaverse, Facebook's meta, right?
Yeah.
Can be polished. I mean,
there are a couple of things, like because of the way that it was created and the coding that was originally created in, there were some updates that needed to be made there to make it a little bit more friendly. But in any case, so I haven't had an update sort of where if Blair has done anything with that. specific issue, but I know that that's where she's aiming, and I know she has a website for it as
Yeah.
well.
I'd be happy to help. I've worked on that in that world, and I know a lot of people who can, because right now one can churn one of those meaning a virtual world very easily if you have the artifacts, right? So a lot of the plumbing and on machine and all that is abstracted to the people who are artists now can do a lot. So I'd be more than happy to engage if you'd like, if you want to pull me in that project just to see how it can help. So
I guess I'll just say also, I mean, I'm very much in the technology world now, with my current position in job and everything, interest as well. But I remember starting that project and being like really intimidated because I had not coded before that project at all. Like I was, I found the technology world to be an intimidating space, and have since, I don't know, come to, live in it.
live in it, yeah. Yeah, I'm a technologist and I no longer code. I just basically work with folks who code. It's a lot cheaper and faster and sturdier. And so I think it just opens up an opportunity for folks who would, like when you were a few years ago intimidated by it, but you had all these great ideas, right? You'd have been able to move by just knowing that there is a lot of very affordable labor folks, people who know how to do these things, they have their tools and they're able to move very, very fast. So it's very exciting that now artists and I just want to make sure that people know. All right, a lot of people don't know. Actually, they just go and they learn a language for 6 months. Like, man, that's not what you should be doing. That's a commodity right now, coding.
No, I'm still not good at coding, but it was a good kind of experience to what it was. And but yeah, agreed. Now I rely on other people to help me with that piece of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, my core competency is product, is product design and all that. And any coding I do, which I haven't done for years, would be total waste of my time. And whatever I churn out would be mediocre. So I avoid that really. So going back to the project. So let's say, okay, so this is a thing now where I can hear sounds, and those sounds, you said there is research to come up with sounds that may have been heard at the time, right?
Yeah. So so like I said, in terms of my academic interest, I had a fair amount of training in Arabic poetry and Quran and so forth, and so was somewhat familiar with the kind of poetry circulating at the time in that location, and so had done a little bit of research to find a couple of examples of what are some historical pieces of poetry that have survived today that would be interesting and relevant to that may have actually been recited, and so I borrowed those, and it's always really interesting, the people that get mentioned in them and the linkages between different, what they're trying to do from a power perspective too, and a social context. We mentioned this person because it links us to this kind of grandeur of the past, and we want to establish ourselves from a sort of class perspective as being among this echelon of people. So anyways, a lot of those things are at play in the types of poetry that might have been recited. And I recited that, I used my own voice for that, which, is not necessarily historically accurate, but in any case, I used my own voice and recited that in Arabic, but I also did a translation of it into English, again, experimenting with, what is it from like even a pedagogical perspective, if we put it into English, is that a way that we can help other people relate to something that seems so distant from them? Like when I was teaching at the university, having students, trying to get students to engage with something that is a millennia old is tricky, right? Because they have trouble just seeing themselves as part of that, but actually having sound and also having something that's familiar, right? Like sounds link us in a way and enliven a space. So they hear birds, that's a familiar sound. They hear something in English, which they don't necessarily understand the context of what's being recited, but at least it's something that's in English, it's recognizable, and it can really place them or relate them to what they're looking at and understand. There's also another group that I looked at that I'm forgetting the name of them now, but they did what they referred to as like musical archaeology. So from a number of different sources, written, but also practice oriented, vocal and so forth, physical, they kind of work to reimagine or recreate to some degree what may have been heard in the past. So everything from creating instruments and, the sort of the way that they would have been created then, the types of instruments, to looking at performers and areas and cultures, and how those performances and performance schools have been passed down. So anyways, so I used it's contemporarily made music, but meant to imitate to some degree the sounds of the past, as well as a fully contemporary singer who is, she's Algerian, but she was trained in the Andalusian school of singing and music in Algeria. And historically, there were a lot of ties between Algeria and Al-Andalus at the time. And so I used her voice as an example of, again, just ways to think about and relate the present to the past, and not in a way that's aimed solely at recreating the past, but aimed in a way to making the past relevant to the present and the present relevant to the past, and creating connections and linkages. Because I think that always helps us to ask new questions, more questions, and helps us to see things that we wouldn't have seen before.
Yeah. Okay. So just to, so let's say I'm a historian, right? Student, and I'm trying to understand that period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read books, I read articles, I go to webinars, seminars, and so forth. And then there's this thing that you created. And let's say I'm focusing on the Andalusian culture or something about that, maybe political, whatever. So when I go and have that experience, I think it seems to me that one of the things that you're striving for is not only being able to see things, but to have this ability to see, hear, and that combination may stimulate dot connections. Like, oh wow, I didn't think about the fact that poetry maybe is related to some political thing, whatever, right? But the fact that you have all these stimuli, I think, right? At least for that use case, where somebody is researching and trying to get immersed in a way, right? Is that, am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's, so one of the pieces of poetry that I chose actually, so it mentions Ziria, who was a poet from the kind of classical Arabic era, born in Baghdad. And he had a pretty, he was known in Baghdad, and he was in Northern Africa for a while, but he really kind of became very famous in Al-Andalus when he kind of made an appearance at the Cordoban court and so forth. But in any case, he's mentioned at the time of this Munya in the 10th century, he would have been dead. But he's mentioned in this poem, and that's a poem that very well may have been recited there based just on the historical evidence. But he was somebody that was very successful. He was allocated one of his own munyas that was very known, like had a reputation for being very extravagant in just any way that you could imagine. It was the material goods, the people there, the music, the food. It also, right, like by connecting via this person to this classical era, invokes legitimacy on this space, right, and on the present era. So you've got a line of continuity. It elevates the person who owns this or who has allotted this munya to the same status of that, right, and it creates an imaginary of the social context of this is just as great, right, or we're as lavish as Ziryab was at his time. So, I mean, even things like that, and that makes you think like, well, how did somebody from Baghdad get to Cordoba? Like very just basic questions, but
Yeah.
were the sound not there, you wouldn't think about it in the same way. Or, there's a lot of imagery about like fruits and vegetation and birds. Somebody might have recited that. I mean, there's imagery in the actual munya itself and the objects that were there, but also in the poetry that may have been recited, which it may just be beautiful, which in and of itself is one thing, but it may also be recited because it's, they're enjoying a meal from the gardens of that munya. And so it's a kind of reflection of, look what my garden has produced and look how lavish this experience is.
Yeah.
Which these munyas, by the way, were used for entertainment purposes as well as political purposes. So making a political statement like that is like, look how great I am and how established and how, elevated I am in sort of our social context.
Yeah. So I'm Algerian, right? Did I tell you that? No?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have some of my family living in Morocco. So when I was a child, I had one aunt, my favorite aunt, and she would come every summer for like a month to visit us in Algiers. And sometimes she brought a couple of her kids. She was an independent woman. Sometimes she came on her own. And there's a museum in Algiers, right? That every time she came, she took us, the kids, to it, right? She loved that museum, right? So me and my brother, my younger brother, we would go with her, like, we roll our eyes, we're going to see the whole damn thing again, right? But what I remember vividly is when we visited the museum. So it had all these artifacts from 19th century Turkey, right? Because Algeria was a part of the Ottoman Empire. So there are all these artifacts, and she loved looking at those artifacts. So we're there, and what I remember is the smell, right, of those carpets, right? The smell of it just made it a lot more real than if you were looking at images. So I think adding sound or smell to the visual, right, just made it more indelible and more real. And the thing is, I think it brings you closer. They're not the other, right, as it were.
Exactly. And that's, and I mean, you mentioned like going to a museum as a kid, and I think that's something that a lot of times as adults we forget, or we're encouraged to forget in the way that have been brought up in the way that, our kind of system works. But if you go to, children's museums and stuff like that, they're made to be interactive, and sound is a big piece of that, right? Of, I want to hear something about that, or I want to hear the car engine rev, right? Like if it's an auto, my dad actually, so they own a building and construction company, but they did a lot of work on this children's museum in Indianapolis. So I'm thinking about that particular instance, but there's so much audio and also tactile, among other things, but interaction. And that's something I think is actually, that's not something that actually goes away. Like when you become an adult, that's something that still exists as part of being a human. I think part of what happens, we get so focused, this is kind of Enlightenment era fallout, I guess. But in any case, we get so focused on the object and from maintaining a distance from the object and from being separated from it, which your eye allows you to do a little bit differently than your ears and voice do, that we don't realize the effective power that we have, or that sound and voice have over us, and the way that sound, that effective power that it does have, really links us to whatever we're doing in a way that just visually looking at something doesn't, right? It forces you to engage with it, and you can't keep it at the same kind of distance where you can put it over there and set it aside. It's something that you kind of are in all of a sudden, and you have to relate to in some way.
Yeah,